It was supposed to be a spontaneous escape, a weekend of adventure away from the city's suffocating routine. Lena had found the place, an old village tucked deep in the countryside, surrounded by dense, ancient woods. The idea of camping there, away from the noise and the people, had sounded perfect, romantic even. The drive took longer than expected. The roads were narrow, winding through rolling hills and thick forests that seemed to grow darker the further we went. By the time we reached the village, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows over the quaint, weathered houses. The village was small, almost eerily quiet. A few locals were out, tending to their evening routines, but they all stopped to stare as we pulled up. Their gazes were unnerving, a mixture of curiosity and something else I couldn't quite place. Lena didn't seem to notice. She was too excited about our plans. We parked near what looked like the village's only store, a little shop with a faded sign hanging above the door. As we walked inside, the bell above the door jangled, announcing our arrival. The shopkeeper, an old man with a deeply lined face, looked up from behind the counter. His eyes were sharp, scanning us in a way that made me feel like an intruder. "Evening," I said, trying to sound friendly. "We're here to do a bit of camping in the woods nearby." At that, the shopkeeper's expression changed. His eyes narrowed, and he shook his head slowly. "Those woods aren't safe," he said, his voice rough with age. "Best find another place to set up camp." Lena laughed, brushing off his warning. "We'll be fine. We're just looking for a quiet spot to spend the night." The old man didn't smile. He just stared at us for a long moment before finally speaking again. "There's a reason those woods are forbidden. You should listen to the locals." I felt a twinge of unease, but Lena was already heading back out the door, eager to get going. I thanked the shopkeeper and followed her out. As we loaded our gear back into the car, I noticed a few villagers watching us from across the street, their faces unreadable. I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Maybe we should listen to them," I said as we drove towards the edge of the woods. "If the locals think it's dangerous—" "Oh, come on," Lena interrupted, rolling her eyes. "It's just an old superstition. We'll be fine. Besides, we've come all this way. We're not turning back now." I didn't argue. She had a way of convincing me to go along with her plans, even when I wasn't sure about them. And so, we drove on, leaving the village behind as we entered the woods. The trees were thick, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out what little light remained. It felt like we were driving into a tunnel, the road narrowing until it was barely more than a dirt path. Finally, we found a small clearing, just big enough to park the car and set up our tent. As we worked to pitch the tent, the sounds of the forest surrounded us, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. We built a small fire, its orange glow casting flickering shadows on the trees around us. Lena was in high spirits, talking about how perfect the spot was, how we'd made the right choice to come here. I tried to match her enthusiasm, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the villagers, to the way they had looked at us, as if they knew something we didn't. We sat by the fire, eating a simple meal and drinking cheap wine from plastic cups. The conversation flowed easily, but there was an undercurrent of tension that neither of us acknowledged. The night grew darker, the fire crackling in the silence. After midnight, when the first strange sound reached us, a soft rustling coming from the trees just beyond the clearing. I paused, my cup halfway to my lips, and listened. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Lena looked at me, her brow furrowed. "Hear what?" I shook my head. "I thought I heard something. Out there." She laughed, a little too loudly. "It's just the wind. Or maybe a deer. Relax. You're getting paranoid." But the rustling continued, closer now. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the night, but all I could see were the trees, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. "I'm going to take a look," I said, more to reassure myself than Lena. She rolled her eyes but didn't protest as I walked to the edge of the clearing. The forest felt different at night, more alive, more menacing. The rustling had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I took a few steps into the woods, my flashlight sweeping over the ground. The trees loomed overhead, their trunks thick and gnarled, as if they had been standing there for centuries. Suddenly there was a loud crack, a branch snapping underfoot. I whipped around, shining the light in all directions, but saw nothing. My heart was pounding in my chest as I hurried back to the campsite. "What was it?" Lena asked as I rejoined her by the fire. "Probably just an animal," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. But I couldn't ignore the growing unease in the pit of my stomach. We sat in silence for a while, the fire slowly dying down. I could see that Lena was starting to feel uneasy too, though she was trying to hide it. The air was thick with tension, the quiet of the forest oppressive. And then we heard the laughter. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper carried on the wind. But it grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. Children's laughter, high-pitched and eerie, echoing through the trees. Lena and I stared at each other, both of us frozen in place. "What the hell?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I grabbed the flashlight again, shining it towards the sound. The laughter stopped abruptly, plunging the forest back into silence. I took a step forward, but Lena grabbed my arm, stopping me. "Don't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's just go back to the tent. It's probably just the wind. Or something." But we both knew it wasn't the wind. We hurried back to the tent, zipping it up tightly behind us. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting a faint light through the thin fabric. We sat in the darkness, listening, our breaths shallow and fast. For a long time, there was nothing, just the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. But the laughter didn't return. I started to relax, telling myself it was just our imaginations playing tricks on us. And then just as I was starting to drift off to sleep, there was a loud bang, a sharp, metallic sound that made us both jump. It was followed by another, and then another, like someone was banging on something metal right outside our tent. We froze, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. The banging continued, louder and more insistent, until it felt like the whole tent was shaking. "Who's out there?" Lena finally screamed, her voice high and panicked. The banging stopped abruptly. We waited, hearts pounding, but there was no response. Just silence, thick and heavy, pressing down on us. Finally, I unzipped the tent and stepped out, my hands shaking. The clearing was empty. There was no sign of anyone, or anything, that could have made those noises. But then I saw it. The car. Our car. It was covered in scratches, deep gouges that marred the paint, the windows smeared with mud. And there, on the hood, was a handprint. A small, muddy handprint, like that of a child. Lena joined me, her eyes wide with fear as she saw the car. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice shaking. We didn't waste any time. We grabbed our gear, throwing it into the car as quickly as we could. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, emerging from the woods. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence and the dark, forbidding trees. We drove away as fast as we could, not looking back. The road was rough, the car bouncing over the uneven terrain, but we didn't care. We just wanted to put as much distance between us and those woods as possible. The beach was supposed to be deserted. That's what made it the perfect spot for a quiet night of camping. This place is quite wild, no tourists, leaving the shoreline to the gulls and the wind. I had planned this trip for weeks, eager to spend a night by the ocean, lulled to sleep by the sound of the waves. The drive was peaceful, the kind of scenic route that clears your mind and lets you breathe. I reached the beach just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. I parked my car at the end of the road, where the asphalt gave way to sand, and unloaded my gear. The beach stretched out before me, a long, empty expanse of sand and sea. The only sign of life was a solitary seagull, wheeling in the sky above. I chose a spot near a cluster of rocks, where the sand was firm and the view of the ocean was uninterrupted. I set up my tent and gathered driftwood for a fire, my heart light with the promise of a peaceful night. As the sun disappeared, the temperature dropped, and a chill settled over the beach. I lit the fire and sat down to watch the waves. The rhythm of the tides is gentle and steady. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of salt and seaweed, but also something else, something faint and unfamiliar, like the memory of something long forgotten. I shook off the feeling and focused on the fire, feeding it driftwood and watching the flames dance against the darkening sky. The stars began to appear, one by one, until the sky was a glittering canvas. It was beautiful, almost hypnotic, and for a while, I lost myself in the serenity of the moment. But then, the wind shifted, bringing with it a sound that made me sit up and listen. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more distinct. A low, mournful wail, like the cry of a distant foghorn. I looked out to sea, but there was nothing, just the endless expanse of water stretching to the horizon. I stood up, suddenly uneasy, and scanned the beach. It was still empty as far as I could see, but the sound persisted, growing louder, more insistent, like a voice calling out from the depths. I couldn't understand the words, if there were any, but the tone was clear, desperate, pleading. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe a trick of the acoustics, the sound of the waves playing tricks on my ears. The fire, which had been burning steadily, suddenly flickered and died, leaving me in darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight and turned it on, sweeping the beam across the beach. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the rocks and the sand. But there was nothing there. No sign of anyone. No explanation for the sound that now seemed to be coming from the very earth beneath my feet. The wailing grew louder, more insistent, and I felt the ground tremble beneath me, as if the very sand was vibrating with the force of the sound. I turned to the ocean, expecting to see something, anything. But there was only the black water, churning and frothing under the moonless sky. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing down on me like a physical weight. The ocean, the wind, even the distant cries of the gulls, all were gone, replaced by a stillness that was more terrifying than any noise. I stood there frozen, waiting for something to happen. But the silence remained unbroken. The air was heavy with a sense of anticipation, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I wanted to run, to flee back to my car, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to do anything but listen to the silence. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I couldn't tell. Time seemed to stretch, the night endless and empty. And then, without warning, the tide began to rise. The water crept up the beach faster than it should have, faster than was natural. The first cold waves lapped at my feet, snapping me out of my paralysis. I turned and ran, the sand sucking at my boots as I scrambled back to the safety of my tent. But the water was faster, rising and surging around me, pulling at me with a force that was far too strong for the gentle slope of the beach. I reached my tent just as the first wave broke over it, knocking me to the ground. I struggled to my feet, gasping for breath, but the water was everywhere, swirling around me, pulling me under. I clawed at the sand, trying to find purchase, but it was like quicksand, sucking me down, filling my mouth and nose with grit and salt. And then, just as suddenly as it had risen, the water receded, leaving me gasping and coughing on the wet sand. The silence returned, oppressive and unnatural. I looked around, expecting to see the ocean, the beach, the sky, but there was nothing. Just darkness, absolute and all-encompassing. I don't know how long I lay there, staring up at the void. But when I finally managed to move, the beach was back to normal. The tide was low, the waves gentle, the sky clear and filled with stars. But the silence remained, and with it, a sense of something lost, something that had been taken and would never return. I packed up my things and left, not daring to look back. I don't know what happened that night, but I do know this. The ocean is a place of secrets, and not all of them are meant to be uncovered.